And so just kind of bear with us through that, because next week is the Student Takeover Sunday, and you will not want to miss that, as the students take over everything from coffee to the music to even sharing testimony in the message part of the gathering next week. So I'm excited for that. But as you turn to Genesis 48, it's going to be page 39 in one of these black Bibles. If you don't have a Bible, this is yours to keep. If you know someone who could use a Bible, you could also give this Bible away to them. And it's a lot of text to cover, and so I'm going to try to break it down the best I can. But there's something that kind of resonated with me as I was digging through the text. And it's a saying that I've heard my kids say often. We just, if you follow the journey, my kids are in all different sorts of activities, and poor them, they have to have stories about them shared all the time. But last week, football started, and so it's that kind of season. The season where, baseball is kind of like that's a cute sport. You hit the baseball. Football's like, I hit somebody, right? And so this week, pads go on, and they're all excited. And I'll never forget, there's moments where both my kids have made a good play, a good tackle, something like that, and they're like, Dad, I'm just built different. And some of you know that kind of saying or that bravado that could come with it. And we like to have that idea when we succeed at something. Well, I'm different. I'm set apart. I've got this tenacity or whatever it is. I'm built different. But yet, if we look at our life, how often do we really let being built different define us? More often than not, we actually let being like everyone else define us. We try to fit a mold. We try to fit what is, quote-unquote, normal. As I was looking through the text, what we see is that God's family is built different. It's not what you would draw up for a family. It's not the way that you would even put the pieces together necessarily. And a lot of it, especially even in light of the New Testament, seems to be a little bit crazy from what we see in Genesis to what they say later. It's built different. But we're kind of attuned or kind of accustomed to having to fit what we think family should look like into a mold, into a certain way. For instance, maybe some of us have always pictured it's the two kids, the wife or husband, and the golden retriever and the white picket fence. Like that is living the American dream. Some of us have been shaped by the media and the way that we've seen it growing up. For some, you grew up in a time where there was a TV. It was small, okay, and it was expensive for a small TV. And you didn't have on-demand, and you didn't get to pick what you watched. You just watched the television, and what was on it actually shaped you more than you realized. I grew up in the generation of the TV guide, so yes, I'm old enough to know what that is, and you had to actually go through a whole magazine to see what was coming up. And now we live in the era of on-demand, where we're just shaped by a million different things. So to give you an idea of how it shaped us, I have 3 different shows that I want to use as an example. The first is The Cleavers from Leave It to Beaver. That's where Ward went to work, June managed a home, and whatever Beaver got into was usually solved before the episode ended. Some of you remember watching that show, and you remember the Cleavers and kind of the picture that it had. The next one was the Brady Bunch, and the Brady Bunch was a blended family, and so we began to see as a society, as a culture, that blended families were something that existed, but yet the blended family fit into these nice little boxes, and they always tried to say together we're the Brady Bunch. And then you have the last one, which some of you don't know what it is. Anyone familiar with the Loud House? Come on, you can raise your hand on this one. All right, we have a few, and they're usually a little younger in the generation. This is what my kids are obsessed with, the Loud House. Now we're in the on-demand generation, so you pick what you want. But the reason I included them, there's 11 kids that live in the Loud House, and they live in a city called Royal Woods. And their rival city is Hazeltucky. Okay? Now, if you're wondering about it, they live in a bungalow with 11 kids in Hazel Woods. The producer of the Loud House is from Royal Oak, Michigan. So he built an entire show around Hazel Park being the rivalry of Royal Oak and called it Royal Woods because of Royal Oak and Harper Woods. Kind of a interesting show, but in all that, there's all these personalities, all of this, and they live in a house that you could imagine is loud. So why do I use these examples? Because over and over, whether it's through media, whether it's through the family we came from, whether it's from our own assumptions, we picture what a perfect family should look like. And I believe even throughout time, people always tried to make God's family look a certain way. For instance, there's these religious leaders that come along named Pharisees and Sadducees. This is during Jesus' time especially, and I would say they were like his rivals almost. You would think that they would get along, but they were always the ones that Jesus was getting into the most arguments with. And these Pharisees and Sadducees, their intention was to really just say, we have one father, and the father is Abraham. And they would trace their lineage through that Jewish ancestry that went back to Abraham. Now in Genesis, we've had Abraham, we've had Isaac, and now we're at Jacob. And so we're kind of looking back at that. And they had the philosophy that we came from the right people, we came from the right nation, we came from the right history, the right bloodline, and that's what makes us a part of God's family. But then John the Baptist comes along, and in Matthew chapter 3, verse 9, he says, "Don't just say to each other, 'We're safe, for we are descendants of Abraham.' That means nothing, for I tell you, God can create children of Abraham from these very stones." In other words, John the Baptist says, don't let being from the bloodline of Abraham be enough for you, because God is so much bigger than that bloodline. His family is built different than you would think. So this gets us to our place in Genesis. Jacob, who we're following, is about to breathe his last. He's about to have his last moments with his sons. And in those last moments, he's about to do something that I believe reveal the heart of who God is, who God was, and who God will continue to be. There's a consistency to God throughout the whole entire Bible and even what we see and experience now with him. And that is through this lineage, through Israel, who is Jacob, we see that God operates the way God is going to operate and not the way they think it should go. His family, like I've said, is built different. The big idea for today is this: grace, or God's grace, is bigger than your background. It's bigger than your birth order, and it's bigger than your brokenness. In other words, we think that my background may not be good enough for God, but His grace is better than any of your background. We might say, I wasn't born in the right place at the right time in the right order, but God has a story for you that is greater than you can think. And some of us think, well, I'm too broken for God, but God has a way of restoring what is broken. So let's start with God is bigger than your background. This would be the first 7 verses of Genesis 48. And so we're going to dig in and get through the first couple. One day, not long after this, word came to Joseph, your father is failing rapidly. So suddenly, Joseph has been, his dad and his siblings and his family all moved down to Egypt. And now his father is failing in health. And some of you have lived this with your own parents or with someone in your own life. Recently, I was given the call that my grandfather was placed on hospice. So what did we do? We got in the car, and my mom and I went down and visited him, and then within a week, he had passed. You've kind of lived this, where you hear the news of someone is failing rapidly. And so they said, your father is failing rapidly, so Joseph went to visit his father. And he took with him his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. So this is what's key to today's text, is he not only goes on his own, he takes who with him? His 2 sons. We're going to dig into these 2 sons for a little bit, because when Joseph arrived, Jacob was told, your son Joseph has come to see you. So Jacob gathered his strength and he sat up in his bed. He has this moment where Jacob gathers all the strength he has, and he's going to have this moment with not only his son Joseph, but with his 2 grandchildren. Well, if we were to just kind of picture it from however we have it made up in our mind, the first thought might be, well, this is a pretty normal moment, right? A son is going to visit his dad, and he brought his 2 kids along, and the grandfather is there to see his grandchildren. But let's dig into the situation a little more to understand how kind of abnormal this is. Genesis 41 has 3 verses that we're going to dig into, and so you don't have to flip the pages. I put them on the screen. But Genesis 41, verse 50 says, "During this time, before the first of the famine years, 2 sons were born to Joseph and his wife, Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, the priest of On." Okay, so why is this important? Well, Joseph, if we recall, he was given an Egyptian name and an Egyptian wife. So this is his wife, and she's not an Israelite, which a lot of Genesis was about preserving the Israelite family. She's what? Egyptian. And not only is she Egyptian, her father is an Egyptian priest. So why is that important? Well, Egyptian priests, if you recall from last week, they got off the hook with having to sell anything for food. They actually were able to get distributions of food. And it's because they represented Pharaoh throughout the land. Pharaoh was considered to be godlike. And so they were that in between God and kind of the Pharaoh representation. And so not only is this wife of Joseph Egyptian, her father is a priest of a cult of different religions. Kind of following me with this? So already we can see this family's a little bit different than we would expect. And not only that, but the name of Joseph's 2 sons are very much wrapped up not in their Israelite identity, but in their Egyptian identity. Let's look at verse 51, for instance. It says that Joseph named his older son Manasseh, for he said, what? God has made me forget all my troubles and everyone in my father's family. In other words, this son represents everything I've forgotten. His name, everything about him, is not about what was good in Israel or Israelite, was it? It was what was good in Egypt. And look at the next one, Ephraim. He said, God has made me fruitful in the land of my grief. He has these 2 boys, and these 2 boys are very much represented by an Egyptian background understanding, more so than they are an Israelite one. And now they're being introduced to their grandfathers, who is 147 years old. He's about to pass. They haven't probably had much of a relationship with him to this time. And there's going to be something powerful that happens. Now, I want to pause there because as they're sitting there at their ailing grandfather's bed, just think of those dynamics. They're sitting there and their identity has been very much wrapped up in the fact that they were raised as Egyptians. They've seen the blessing of being Egyptians. When there was famine, their dad was in charge of the storehouses, and so they had all the food they needed. Their dad was second in charge of Egypt, and so they had no reason to be upset with being Egyptian. And now they meet their Israelite grandfather. And this is what he says to them. Jacob said to Joseph, God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me. He said to me, I will make you fruitful and I will multiply your descendants. I will make you a multitude of nations, and I will give this land of Canaan to your descendants after you as an everlasting possession. What is really happening here is Jacob is saying, look, Joseph, God gave our family a promise. And that promise was not here in Egypt. That promise was in the land of Canaan. And it's there in the land of Canaan that he promised to bless us, to make us a people and a nation, to be able to help us be able to prosper. And he's saying this with his grandkids there. So think of what they're taking in now, right? Their whole life has been wrapped up in this Egyptian lifestyle and what they were. And all of a sudden, they're being presented by this idea by their grandfather of being an Israelite. I'm going to pause there for a second because I think to put it in our context, let's not use Israelite as an idea. Let's just be a follower of Jesus as an idea. How many times do people say, I would never step into a church because of who I am or where I've been? I'm a pastor, so kind of that goes everywhere I go, right? And someone will find out about that, and they'll say, oh my goodness, like all of a sudden they stop swearing, number one. And then number two, I'll hear this quite often, you would never find me caught dead in your church. When I hear that, I'm like, okay, like we got a starting point. But the reason is because someone feels so guilty about where they've come from, their background, what they've experienced, that they don't understand or feel they would be worthy to be in the church. Some of you maybe felt that at one point. Some of you may have felt that today, even coming into the church. Am I even worthy enough to walk into a church? I'll tell you, one of the scariest places to walk into is the church. I'm a pastor. Like, that's what I do. And yet, if I go visit a friend's church, I will sit in my car till 5 minutes after the gathering begins so that I don't have to feel awkward walking into a church. Maybe you've experienced that. Maybe I'm the crazy one. But sometimes it's just really nerve-wracking to walk into a church. Will I belong? Will I have a place? Can I be accepted? Hearing this blessing, I imagine these two grandsons are wondering, okay, that's great. This blessing that I'm hearing about, and for our dad, Joseph, that's really nice and it's kind of cute, but what about me? Well, I have found that one of the best ways for Satan to keep someone away from God's family is to tell them they don't belong, to tell them there's no place for them, to tell them their past is too bad, to tell them that there's no way that they could ever fit. And then I look at our text, and if the grandchildren of a Egyptian priest, raised in all of this Egyptian can belong, and you're going to see how they belong, everyone else has a place to belong in God's family. So this is where it gets really juicy. Are you ready? So he tells them this blessing, then verse 5 happens. Now, I am claiming as my own sons these two boys of yours. Does he say I'm claiming them as my grandsons? No, he says, I'm claiming them as my sons. Ephraim and Manasseh, who were born here in the land of Egypt before I arrived, they will be my sons. He repeats it, just as Reuben and Simeon are. In other words, he says, look, not only are they my grandkids, they are going to be in the same place of my two firstborn children. This is a huge deal for him to be saying this. He is claiming them. He's put this blessing. He said, remember the blessing God gave me in the town or the area of Luz? This same blessing that he gave there is a blessing that would carry over not only to you, Joseph, but to who? Your own two children. I think we can easily gloss over a story like this. But this is such a beautiful example of how God's family is built different than we would think. See, when we put things into human, finite minds of thinking, we build things in a way that makes sense to us, but not necessarily makes sense to God. For those of you who are history buffs, I'm going to try to be a little history buff here. This is what the internet led me to. But the British monarchy, I'm not an expert in the British monarchy. I think the British monarchy is crazy to try to follow how it all works. But did you know in 1701, Sophie of Hanover made an act for the British monarchy declaring that all heirs had to be heirs of the body. In other words, you could not be an heir to the monarchy unless you came from the right bloodline. It was all about creating this pure bloodline. In other words, adoption cannot create an heir. But throughout God's story, throughout his family, he gives outsiders an inheritance over and over again. Let's look at the words of Jesus. That's probably a good place to go. Jesus says this in Matthew 8, chapter 11. I tell you this, that many Gentiles will come from all over the world, from the east and the west. So who are Gentiles? They're non-Jews. So you have these Jews who claim the bloodline of Abraham, of Isaac, of Jacob, who we're looking at. And Jesus says Gentiles are going to come from all over the world, from east and west, and sit down with who? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob at the feast of the kingdom of heaven. In other words, God's family is not divided by being Israelite or not. John 3:16 says, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son. Now that doesn't mean that every single person that ever breathes has eternity in heaven, but it does mean that that is available for every single person, and that your bloodline doesn't define if you can be a part of God's family or not. Let me go so far to say that the bloodline doesn't actually get you anywhere, but the shed blood of Jesus does. That it's his shed blood that is the only way to actually get access into the family of God. And so we see this as claiming their own boys, bringing them in. We ourselves are adopted. We're taken into God's family when we profess Jesus as Lord of our life. We're adopted in. And so no matter what your background is, no matter where you've come from, there is room for you in the family of God. The next, though, is sometimes we think that X needs to lead to Y, that needs to lead to Z, and we need to go in a certain order for things to work out. I need to go to VBS, and then I need to go to Sunday school, and after I go to Sunday school, I'm going to grow up as a nice church person, and then after I grow up as a nice church person, I'm going to be a perfect church person my whole life, and it's going to be beautiful. My family's going to be church people, and then that's amazing. If we can see that happen, like, hallelujah, we're doing things well, right? Like, we need to celebrate that. But many of us didn't follow that order, did we? Some of us got here in different ways. And so God's grace is not just bigger than your background. God's grace is bigger than your birth order. See, this is when God's grace goes beyond how we think the order of things need to work. And this is where we dig into verses 8 to 22. Jacob looked over at the two boys in verse 8, and he says, "Are these your sons?" "Yes," Joseph told him, "these are the sons God has given me here in Egypt." And Jacob said, "Bring them closer to me so I can bless them." He's going to give this moment where this blessing takes place. Jacob was half blind because of his age and could hardly see. So Joseph brought the boys close to him, and Jacob kissed and embraced them. Then Jacob said to Joseph, "I never thought I would see your face again, but now God has let me see your children too." I mean, that's a powerful moment, isn't it? Think of all the things God has done to get them to this point. Joseph moved the boys who were at their grandfather's knees, and he bowed with his face to the ground. Then, this is Joseph doing the positioning, he positioned the boys in front of Jacob. With his right hand, he directed Ephraim toward Jacob's left hand, and with his left, he put Manasseh at Jacob's right hand. The right hand is the hand of blessing, right? So here's Joseph saying, let me make sure I line up the boys right. Because dad's going blind, and dad doesn't know what's going on, and we have to make sure that the older son gets the proper blessing. And so he lines them up. Joseph starts with what we would all assume. The older son should get the blessing. And this is where I find in our own faith journey, we have times where we try to assume how God's going to work. We try to line things up the way we think it should go. It needs to be like this. Think about your job, for instance. How many times have you been passed, not to get into a wound, but you've been passed over for a promotion by someone who's worked at the company shorter than you? You feel like, you know what, I've been here a long time, I've done my dues, I deserve that promotion. And then it's given to the person that's been there 6 months, and you're like, what the heck? Or there's the times in your family where you're like, well, I thought this should line up to this, and it just didn't line up that way. Maybe you're the oldest child, and so you feel like you were entitled to something that you didn't get. I could go on and on with situations where we think it should go one way, but then it goes the exact opposite way. That's verse 14. Joseph lines everything up. He says, here's the older son, here's the younger son. He's prepared for the blessing. Verse 14, but Jacob did what? Crossed. Come on, you can, I want to make sure you're awake. Jacob crossed his arms as he reached out and lay his hands on the boy's head, and he put his right hand on the head of Ephraim, though he was the younger boy, and his left hand on the hand of Manasseh, though he was the firstborn. All of a sudden, Jacob does what? He crosses his arms. This is a pretty big moment, because he's putting his arm in who Joseph would assume is the wrong kid to get the blessing. So it goes on, may God, before whom my grandfather Abraham and my father Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this very day, the angel who has redeemed me all harm, may he bless these boys. Man, this is a powerful, powerful word. Over and over he's saying, look, God has stood by me each and every step of the way. He stood by me when I didn't know where to go. He stood by me through those 7 years of working for Laban. He stood by me when I had to work for Laban another 7 years. He stood by me when I wandered. He stood by me when Joseph disappeared and I thought he was dead. He stood by me when Rachel died. He stood by me in all of these moments of hurt and pain and sorrow. Remember last week he said it's been a hard life. He says God has stood by me each and every step of the way. The angel who has redeemed me from all harm, may he bless these boys. May they preserve my name and the names of Abraham and Isaac, and may their descendants multiply greatly throughout the earth. And all of a sudden, he's putting this blessing on these boys. And he's saying, may they be the future of this family. But remember, his arms were crossed. So verse 17 says, Joseph was upset when he saw that his father placed his right hand on Ephraim's head. So Joseph lifted it to move it from Ephraim's head and put it on Manasseh's head. How often do we see God working in our lives and it's like a crossed arms type of working? And we're like, no, God, it's got to work this way, not this way. It doesn't make sense this way makes sense. And so we try to move the arms. Joseph is trying to move his dad's arms, saying, no, you're doing it wrong, Pops, you're blind, come on. And he uncrosses his arms. He's upset with him. But Joseph and Jacob have this moment. But his father refused, verse 19. I know, my son, I know, he replied. Manasseh will also become a great people, but his younger brother will become even greater, and his descendants will become a multitude of nations. So Jacob blessed the boys that day before this blessing. The people of Israel will use your names when they give a blessing. They will say, may God make you as prosperous as Ephraim and Manasseh. In this way, Jacob put Ephraim ahead of Manasseh. Then Jacob said to Joseph, look, I am about to die, but God will be with you and will take you back to Canaan, the land of your ancestors. And beyond what I am giving your brothers, I am giving you an extra portion of the land that I took from the Amorites with my sword and bow. He blesses Joseph. He blesses these boys. And he says, look, one day your family's going to inherit this land of Canaan, and God's going to bring you back. He leaves them with this promise. Now, this promise is full of so many different things, but mainly I see a promise that's so different than what we would expect. Jacob is insistent on blessing the younger rather than the older. Now, I have several theories of why that would be. My first theory is simply this. Jacob had an older brother. Do you remember his older brother's name? Esau. Esau was the older brother, but who received the blessing? Jacob. Kind of similar because Isaac was going blind as well. So part of me thinks, is it just to have continued what happened in his own family? Now it's a little bit different, but think about then not only his father, but his grandfather Abraham. Abraham was the second son born. Now they had different moms, but there was a son before named who? Ishmael. But who received the blessing? Abraham. And so Jacob sees this trend throughout history that the second one sometimes, or oftentimes in this case, was receiving the blessing. That could have been why, but I think it goes deeper than that. I believe it's because over and over, God's blessing doesn't follow human ranking. That's why Jesus tells a parable. And it's the parable of the people working in the field. And the workers are getting mad because he pays the same amount of wage to the people that work just a part of the day than those who work the whole day. It's a picture of no matter when you come to faith, your inheritance is still the same. I think God continually shows us this messed up order so that it humbles us enough to know we're not deserving of something, but he had to do something to give us something that we don't deserve. Which gets to the last point. God's grace is bigger than your brokenness. We're going to see, and we see throughout the history of Jacob's family, it's full of a lot of brokenness. I mean, you have brothers selling brother and betraying each other. You have all the different things that take place, and God redeems it. And I think that oftentimes when we say grace is bigger than your brokenness, I could sit here and I could say, look at all the ways that God has overcome our shortfalls, all the ways that he's forgiven us. I could go for hours and hours about how I don't deserve his grace, but yet how gracious he has been to forgive me. And we're going to end with the story of Judah and see how that is ultimately the story in this of how God overcomes someone who made some bad choices, but yet gives them a bright future. And so we can sit and we could say, well, God's grace covers all of our multitude of sins, and God's grace washes us white as snow. But I can't skip over the first three sons before I get to Judah. And this is the part in church that I think can be the tough part. Because God's grace is so amazing. And grace in its purest form is getting something that we don't deserve. We didn't deserve Jesus to go to a cross, to die, and to raise for us. Did we? No, we didn't. God didn't have to sacrifice his one and only Son for us, but he did. That's grace. But the question becomes, what do you do with grace? See, grace is bigger than your brokenness, but it's never dishonest about it. It's one thing to rest in his grace. It's another thing to abuse it. I believe the first three sons represent sons that were in the stage of transformation, with the first two particularly not really being in a place of repentance. So Jacob, chapter 49, verse 1, called together all his sons, and he said, "Gather around me, and I will tell you what will happen to each of you in the days to come." So he lines them up, and he gives a prophecy of what's going to happen. "Come and listen, you sons of Jacob. Listen to Israel, your father." So he starts with the oldest, Reuben. And he says, "Reuben, you are my firstborn, my strength, the child of my vigorous youth. You are first in rank and first in power." In other words, look, you're first in line. "But you are as unruly as a flood, and you will be first no longer. For you went to bed with my wife, you defiled my marriage couch." In other words, he says, look what you did, and you're unrepentant of that. So what came of Reuben? Well, the tribes are able to get to the promised land eventually. I'm jumping or a lot of years. They get to the promised land eventually. Reuben's tribe actually basically disappears. It becomes unknown. And so while there's Reuben, and while we know that as a tribe of Israel, it actually dissipates. Then there's Simeon and Levi. And he says, Simeon and Levi are two of a kind. Their weapons are instruments of violence. May I never join in their meetings, for I never be a party to their plans. For in their anger they murdered men, and they crippled oxen just for sport. A curse on their anger, for it is fierce. A curse on their wrath, for it is cruel. I will scatter them among their descendants of Jacob. I will disperse them throughout the land of Israel. So all of a sudden, we have Simeon and Levi. And Simeon, after initially getting a foothold near Shechem, and he was disposed and nearly annihilated by the Canaanite revenge. Though the tribe managed to recover, it was then on Judah's southern border, and eventually Simeon became merged with neighboring tribes and was absorbed by Judah. So what happens to Simeon's tribe? Same thing that happened to Reuben's tribe, kind of just disappears. Then you have the Levites. And the Levites receive no land allocation, but this is where you begin to see the grace and the change take place. Because they had this curse transformed into a blessing, where they became the priestly tribe that carried the tabernacle and then took care of the temple. So there's three brothers, the first three, and their history shows that there were consequences. But then you get to Judah. And Judah is the one that throughout Genesis I have been saying, pay attention to Judah. And the reason is because he's the fourth brother, but it really reveals God's grace to the point that grace is bigger than your brokenness. It says this about Judah in verse 8, Judah, your brothers will praise you. You will grasp your enemies by the neck, and all your relatives will bow before you. Judah, my son, is a young lion and has finished eating its prey. Like a lion, he crouches and lies down. Like a lioness, he dares to rouse him. The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from his descendants, until the coming of the one whom it belongs, to whom all nations will honor. His ties his fowl to a grapevine, the colt of his donkey to a choice vine. He washes his clothes in wine, his robes in the blood of grapes. His eyes are darker than wine, and his teeth whiter than milk. All of a sudden, we see Judah come along. And Judah is an interesting one, because Judah had all of these moral deficiencies. Let's start with Joseph. Joseph is in the well, and what does Judah say? Well, why would we kill our brother if we have nothing to gain? And so he's the one who comes up with the plan to sell his brother for financial gain. And then later on, Judah is the one who promises to Tamar that his son will marry her, but does he really let his son marry her? No. And then he goes so far as Tamar comes up with this plan, dresses as a prostitute, he sleeps with her, and then it's in that moment that she takes his cord and his seal, and then she presents it in public to everyone to see. And it is there that then Judah says, you know what? She is more righteous than I am. Now, this is why it's important. Nowhere do we see Levi, Simeon, or Reuben ever repenting. But we see Judah coming to a place of repentance, and not only privately, but it's publicly. Judah's life is changed in such a way that his whole entire character changes. He doesn't just experience grace, he lives by it then. So what happens with Judah? Benjamin is going to be taken, and instead of Benjamin, he says what? Take me instead. All of a sudden, he understands what it looks like to live a life that is sacrificing for others rather than serving himself. He didn't always live that way, but now he does. And so what does his father say? He says, from you will be the Messiah. From you, the scepter will not depart until the Messiah comes and claims it for himself. You are the one who will have a robe that is in the grapes. What happened through his line? Well, we get King David. King David leads to King Solomon. We have the temple built through this family. And then eventually, who comes out of that lineage? Jesus, the Messiah. And what's he going to do? He's going to take on the blood of the perfect, spotless lamb, and he's going to sacrifice himself for you and for me. It's all the way back in Genesis chapter 49 that we already see a picture of what Jesus is going to do for us. And we see a picture of what redemption looks like. And we see a picture of how God will not define us by what we've done, but what he can do through us. But here's the challenge, church. We have to have a repentant heart. We have to have a change. We can't just claim Jesus and have Jesus as fire insurance in our life and say it's really great to have Jesus by my side if he's not truly changing the way we live. Are we a people who is trying to get a gain for self, or are we a people who, when Benjamin is going to be taken, say, take me instead? If we truly want the blessing of God, we have to be willing to be last and not first. And Judah represents this in a beautiful, beautiful way. See, you didn't enter God's family because you have the right parents. You don't enter because you grew up in church. There's not a day where you can say, well, God, I went to church every single Sunday. I hope that going to church every single Sunday would lead you to a closer relationship with him. You don't enter because you say the right thing. You don't enter because you have the right position or an impressive past. You enter because of what Jesus Christ did for you. And the only way you enter is by truly claiming him as your Savior and Lord. So what does that mean? God's family is built different because God's family is built by grace. The Cleavers were neat. The Bradys fit into the boxes, and the Louds at the Loud house barely fit into a house. But Jacob's family did not fit any picture-perfect family. But God didn't abandon them because it was complicated. And he doesn't abandon us when it's complicated either. The question is, are we letting what we think is too complicated from God put a wall between us and him? Or are we letting him break that wall down? Welcome us in as that prodigal son seeing that loving father who's running to him. And are we letting God embrace us with his love, his grace, and his mercy? Because if he could use Joseph's 2 Egyptian sons, he can use you. If he could use Judah, he could use you. There is nothing that could separate us from the love of God with Jesus Christ right there sacrificing for us. So are you letting him in? Because his family wants you so badly to be a part of it. Will you pray with me? Heavenly Father, we thank you for the fact that you are a God who loves us so immensely, that you give all of your